For years, Joe Montana football was the highlight of Sega sports games. With the voice of Lon Simmons, Sports Talk Football was a game unlike any other. And this game was the epitome of Genesis does what Nintendo don't. By 1995, however, the commentary was gone, and all of a sudden, the franchise was awful. And not even the Sega Saturn could save it. So what happened here? I mean, how is it that such a legendary franchise turned into such a ridiculously bad game? Now, you guys know that we're going to do a deep dive into all of this today, and I'm looking forward to it. First of all, though, I do want to ask a favor of you. If you enjoy the content on this channel, would you mind thinking about sponsoring me? As you guys know by now, I cover a lot of games and topics that other channels just don't cover. So if you enjoyed this content, please consider sponsoring the channel. It's $4 a month that gets you to become a member. You get videos as soon as they're uploaded. It's usually a week early. Or consider becoming a member of my Patreon for additional videos, bonuses, and access to my 8 terabytes of vintage sports files and counting. And all of that is going to continue growing over time. Now, one way or another, you guys already know that this is the only vintage gaming channel that's ever going to cover games like these old Joe Montana games, right? I mean, everybody else that even bothers to play it is going to say, oh, this is the Madden clone, and they're going to just ignore it. Anyway, we're going to dive really deep today, and that means going way back to the beginning of Sega's football games. The first Sega football game was this baby, Great Football. This game hails back to 1987, which means it's really one of the first console-based football games out there. I think the NES only had 10-yard fight back then. And the title screen looks okay, I guess. But, I mean, you guys already know what to expect from the Sega Master System, right? I mean, it's certainly not going to be perfect, that's for sure. There are 11 guys per team. I counted them, and yes, they're all there. The game itself, well, it's a football game, I'll give you that. You've got different formations, which is impressive for the Master System. And you choose a formation and a play sort of happens. Anyway, it turns out that you only select the formation, not an actual play, and then the plays keep flashing by in case you're playing 2-player and you want to, surprise your friend. The system can barely display the graphics. This is literally the cutting edge of what the Master System could do. Still, even though this game sucks, it's actually pretty impressive for 1987. And I really mean that, by the way. Yeah, this game's a piece of crap when you compare it to like modern football games. It has not held up well. You can go back and play it and you'll play it for like 5 minutes and you're not going to want to play it again. But for its time, it was really impressive. And it was sure a lot better than that awful 10-yard fight. Now, normally I would show you reviews from video game magazines, but there weren't exactly a ton of independent video game reviewers back in 1987. Anyway, it took 2 more years, but Sega did wind up with another shot at a football game before too long. Walter Payton Football came out in 1989, and this was a huge improvement over Great Football. The title screen looks better, and the music is actually pretty good. The game gives you a few options and a selection of every NFL team, even though it doesn't have that license. The view here is vertical, not horizontal, and the game actually plays pretty quickly. This game is impressive for an 8-bit game. Now, this isn't exactly Tecmo Bowl, and remember that Tecmo Bowl came out on the NES a year before this game on the Sega Master System. But this game is still better than the vast majority of NES football games, including games that came out later. Remember that this game came out the same year as LJN's NFL. Haha, remember that one? I'm betting that the poor kids that got LJN's game for Christmas really wish that they had a Sega Master System instead. You can actually call plays in this game, surprise surprise, and it keeps track of all sorts of stats and situations. Really, my only complaint is that the graphics are pretty janky. Passes look like punts, which is kind of funny when you think about it. Now, the important thing about Walter Payton Football, and the reason I started with these early games, is because this game is the one that set the precedent for Sega to use celebrity endorsements in its games. And that's really what Genesis does what Nintendo don't was all about. Sports games were really Nintendo's biggest weakness back in those days, and the folks over at Sega knew it. It was really Michael Katz, the president of Sega America at the time, who pushed the idea of getting big-name celebrities under contract to kick Nintendo in the butt. It was in March 1990 that Sega signed a deal with famous quarterback Joe Montana to bring him along as a sponsor for an upcoming Genesis football game. This was a really big deal, of course. Everybody thought that Montana's star power would push Sega over the top. The deal gave Montana over $1 million per year over 5 years, and this was a really big risk to Sega. Now, Montana was not the only big name that Sega signed, but he was the only professional athlete who was still active. So Sega dropped tons of money on Joe Montana and had to save its pennies in other places. So it went after, for example, the coach Pat Riley instead of Michael Jordan, and went after manager Tommy Lasorda instead of Jose Canseco. But it was never going to compromise on its football game, that's for sure. The most famous advertising campaign in video game history began in summer 1990, and it spread really quickly. Sega combined its catchy slogan with a bunch of star power, well, provided that you cared about sports managers, that is. Aside from Montana, the biggest name Sega had was clearly Michael Jackson, and that print ad came out not long after this famous game showed up in arcades for the first time. Of course, these days, the thought of Michael Jackson saving prepubescent boys is kind of alarming, but things were different back in 1990. Anyway, as you can see in the ad, Sega proudly announced Joe Montana Football about half a year before the game was actually released. And that was a problem. You see, Sega was technically making this game in-house, technically, but not really. Just like most other video game companies at the time, Sega was basically outsourcing everything, and it thought that it had a company that knew what it was doing on the Genesis. The idea apparently was to take Great Football, the oldest game, and just update it into 16-bit. But the problem is that whatever company it was that Sega outsourced this to did basically nothing. If you look closely, you'll notice that the early advertising for this game shows a different game than the one that we got. This game is clearly a horizontal football game, and it looks like an updated version of Great Football. In reality, the game was a vertically oriented game, and it played like a stripped-down version of Madden. So the story here goes that Sega was in a total panic. It was like October or November and Christmas was coming and they didn't have a game at all. And so what do you do when you can't do anything? Well, easy, you make a deal with the devil. Sega begged EA Sports, which is Satan incarnate, to help it make its game. EA obliged, but basically gave Sega a stripped down version of Madden with a limited playbook. If you look closely at the commercial, you will see that they did have a prototype that was horizontal, but the game was never released. Interestingly enough, the Sega Master System version of the game was horizontal, though it only featured 9 players per side. Anyway, the Sega Genesis version of this game is clearly superior and is really the only one that you should bother with. And even though this game wasn't released in time for Christmas, it was still a big hit. Now, it's really surprising to me how many people tell me that they like the first Joe Montana game the best. In fact, there are people who preferred the first Joe Montana game to the first Madden game on the Genesis, even though they're the same game and the Montana version is supposed to be stripped down. The truth is that Montana is actually a little bit faster and it's a lot smoother, and I don't think that Electronic Arts intended to make it like that. Still, the game was a failure in terms of marketing. For example, this GamePro review didn't come out until April 1991. That's 4 months too late. Despite missing a lot of promised features, GamePro gave the game a pretty positive review. And even though GamePro called Madden the better game, it still gave the first Joe Montana game a great score. Now that's typical GamePro, of course. The thing is, with GamePro back then, as long as you paid a little bit up front, you got a good review. Anyway, Joe Montana 2 was out in November 1991, and it was just a huge improvement on the first game. And it's probably a better game than Madden 92. Don't attack me, but if you play both of them, you're gonna agree. This was the first football game to use that sports talk feature, which allowed for commentary as the game went along.
New Orleans has it.
This was an absolutely fantastic feature. In fact, the whole game is great.
Wide open down the middle. He takes it. He's leveled at the 44-yard line.
Okay, the zoom feature wasn't so great, but everything else here is just fantastic.
Has it. Oh, he's down at the 34-yard line.
I guess you might say that the gameplay is a little bit slow.
Montana back to throw. He's sacked back at the 30-yard line.
But it was actually a lot faster than Madden 92 and had better play control too. In fact, this famous ambulance was the only advantage that Madden 92 had over the Joe Montana game. Now, I don't want to make it sound like Madden and Montana were bitter rivals, though there was kind of a rivalry going on. Really, both of these games were working together to try to help the Sega Genesis beat out the Super Nintendo. And remember, back in 1992, the Super Nintendo didn't have a single good football game. It had a bunch of junky games that, anyway, we'll talk about those ones later. The thing is, though, that Montana had a much better game out of the box for Christmas 1991, even if the video game magazines did not realize it. The advertisements, of course, put a huge emphasis on the play-by-play, which was unheard of in 16-bit gaming. GamePro absolutely loved this game, putting it in front of its review of Madden 92. It gave Montana 2 a full 5-star rating, but of course there's that famous grade inflation. And of course, EA Sports made sure to buy a good enough rating for Madden as well. So I hate to be that level of cynical, but come on, you guys know that this is true. I mean, just look at it, right? Montana 2 was clearly a better game than Madden 92. And Montana 3 was a stellar game, even though Madden 93 was really good. The truth is that Montana 93 and Montana 94 are basically the same game. The commentary here is expanded and the gameplay is second to none.
He's going to pass. The pass complete to the back at the 37.
And the cool thing is that you're not forced to stick with this horizontal view.
Back to pass. He's sacked at the 42. That brings up second down for the Vikings.
Sega was able to figure out a way to allow you to change from a horizontal view to a vertical view, and it gave you a couple of different options for each.
Pitch to the back. Up the middle. He's down at the 9.
This was an incredibly impressive feature, especially for what year is this, like 1992? This was basically unheard of back then. It wasn't quite as cool as games these days where you have like an infinite number of different camera angles and you can go anywhere you want and all that stuff, but this wasn't that far off. And this was something that Madden couldn't even dream of doing back then. In general, I prefer to use the side view for passing plays.
He goes nowhere. Brings up second down for the Vikings.
The vertical view seems to work best on defense and running plays, and you can choose whether you want your team on the top or the bottom of the screen. My only real complaint here is that the zoom mode is really distracting, though you can turn it off.
Good blocking. Better hurry. Straight up the middle. Break the tackle. He's down.
Now, Madden 93 is an all-time classic, but it was slower, it had no play-by-play, and it only had this one camera angle.
You'll remember that number.
Plus, it took forever to play Madden because you were waiting for substitutes to come onto the field like all the time. That was Madden's biggest weakness for so many years. Anyway, the thing that Madden had on its side was the press, and it really shows. I swear, EA was straight up bribing these journalists. GamePro gave Montana 93 the first slot on its holiday sports page again. The review was incredibly positive, much better than the written review for Madden, but Montana's game missed the perfect score. It did score a little bit higher than Madden, though I'm not sure that most kids actually noticed. Meanwhile, Montana 94 was basically called the Madden Slayer in GamePro. The review highlighted the numerous camera angles, and remember, this simply did not exist in 1993. This game got a perfect score, and well deserved. Things were looking good, right? Well, sort of. It was right around this time that Sega made its biggest mistake. Sega went all in on the Sega CD, and you know that cost the company. Now, I know everybody likes to rip on the Sega CD. We can probably thank the AVGN for at least some of that. The truth is that it wasn't a bad idea, except for the fact that you had to have it attached to the Genesis. In hindsight, it feels like Sega was so desperate to get to the next generation of console gaming that it decided to skip a few steps and kind of force its way forward. The Sega CD was priced to match the Turbo Duo, except that it wasn't a standalone system like the Turbo Duo was, and it really paid the price. Yeah, you had to pay $300 for that baby brand new, and you could only use it if you already had a Genesis. If you didn't already have one, that's another $200. And now you can still play your old Genesis games, but the CD doesn't do anything to them. If you want to use the CD, you got to buy the new CD games, and they're more expensive. Plus, it turns out that the Sega CD's graphics were not noticeably better. The reason why is because the hardware was set up so that the Sega CD had to go through the Sega Genesis to display the video. So the processor inside could do 3D effects and stuff like that, but if you're talking about the color range, if you're talking about the resolution and stuff like that, all of that was exactly the same as the Sega Genesis, and as a result, most of the games looked exactly the same. Anyway, this was the Attitude Era of American society, and so Sega announced its superiority loud and clear. Notice too that Sega features screenshots of a football game in almost all of these ads. This game was Joe Montana's NFL Football, which was Sega's big mistake. The problem is that back in those days, nobody knew how to make a 3D football game. So this game came out in October 1993. It's about half a year before Madden came out with that weird 3DO game that was like 2D, 3D. Anyways, this is basically your first attempt at a real full-on 3D football game. And so basically, Sega was going into this thing just completely blind, and it didn't end up very well. Right from the opening kickoff, you can tell that there's something just wrong with this game. Everything is really slow, and the camera makes it impossible to see what you're trying to do. The graphics just feel delayed, and worst of all, this game doesn't have any announcing. This strange scrolling thing with the camera where you pass would wind up becoming a staple of the franchise, and guys, this is not a good thing. Alright, I don't get it, guys, right? So most of these Sega CD games had like the same graphics as the Genesis version, but they offered expanded audio when they were ported to the Sega CD, right? Because it was a CD, right? What do you use a CD for, right? Think about it. Anyway, this game had less audio. Like, what were they thinking? This doesn't make any sense. What idiot designed this game? Bill Walsh College Football on the Sega CD had much better sounding audio, but kept the same graphics as the Genesis Classic.
Touchdown!
This is a fun game though. It's a lot better than Montana CD.
Interception!
NHL 94 is also exactly the same on the Sega CD, except with video clips and vastly improved sound. Even NBA Jam is the same on the Sega CD, including the graphics. The only difference is the CD quality audio. Seriously, I don't understand what in the world Sega was thinking when it came out with this piece of crap. Anyway, this is a total travesty. I mean, I want to rip my hair out over this, right? The series was at an all-time high, everybody was happy, and then they just decided to totally screw it up. And it was all to show off a system that didn't sell well anyway. The Sega CD was just totally a major flop. Then came the 32X, which was an even worse flop, and as for the Sega Saturn, we'll get to that one in a second. Anyway, as you can imagine, the video game magazines weren't exactly kind to this pile of filth. GamePro had a huge article about how great the Bill Walsh game was on the Sega CD. They gave it really close to a perfect score. Underneath was this far less complimentary article about the Montana Sega CD game, and this score made no secret about what they really thought. And that is where the fall took place. Sega should have never released that Sega CD game. They should have at least, like play tested it beforehand. They clearly didn't. And the biggest mistake of all was allowing the Montana series to follow in the footsteps of the Sega CD failure. By 1995, Joe Montana was with the Kansas City Chiefs, but his game suddenly really sucked. I can't figure out how I'm supposed to kick off. I mean, what is this? While the slight screen scrolling is pretty cool, you only get this one screen view. It's not like the earlier game. And there's no announcer voice at all, which is the biggest ripoff of all. Seriously, they had that voice back in freaking 1991. NFL 95 came out at the end of 1994 and they got rid of it? Like, somebody needs to have been fired for that, I'm serious. Anyway, the game is a total piece of trash, and this is where the series really jumps the shark. Technically, this isn't a Joe Montana game since it doesn't actually have his name on the cover, but whatever. The newspapers still called it Joe Montana 95, and it's kind of obvious that it was supposed to be Montana, what with the Chiefs on the cover and all. Anyway, GamePro's editors were apparently smoking crack since they made NFL 95 the feature game. They actually gave this game a fantastic rating, which is totally ridiculous. It got the same grade as Madden 95, and guys, you gotta be kidding me. So I've gone through a whole bunch of these GamePro reviews. If you've seen a lot of other videos on this channel, you know this. I can assure you that most of the time, these guys had no idea what they were talking about. Anyway, as for the Joe Montana series, it was all downhill from here. Since Montana was flirting with retirement, Sega signed Deion Sanders to see if that would turn its franchise around for the 1996 version. The cover looks cool, sure, but this game really sucks. I mean, yeah, like it looks cool and all, but looks can be deceiving. This is literally the same game as the previous year's game. This game is a little bit faster than NFL 95, but it's really not much of an improvement at all. And seriously, like I said, my biggest gripe here is that they got rid of the broadcaster. They got rid of the one thing that made this series really stand out. They just completely got rid of it, and there was no reason for it, right? It's totally bizarre. And the worst part for Sega is that the Madden series was steadily improving. I mean, Madden 94 is basically the same as the earlier games, and it still plods along pretty slowly. Madden 95, however, was a major improvement and was one of the best games in the history of the franchise. Madden 96 looks incredible, and it's a lot faster. I mean, sure, you can still do really cheap things to get easy touchdowns, but this game was a lot better than primetime NFL. In fact, it's not even close.
Oh no, there's a man.
Like, seriously, how could they have screwed this up so badly? I mean, it was so easy. They just had to keep making games just like NFL 94. That's all. Just make the same game over and over again and do the stupid roster update thing like Madden does. Instead, they decided to redo the franchise and make it all like that awful Sega CD game that nobody liked. In December 1995, GamePro gave Madden all the attention. And the real big game was Madden 96 on the Super NES. This is when they finally figured out how to program for that console. Primetime got this miniature article that you probably missed because of that huge Vector Man ad that was right next to it. And guys, these ratings really suck. Look, like I've said, this is not just a graphics thing. I know that we look back on this and think, oh look, it's a 16-bit game, 16-bit graphics, ha ha ha. No, it's the gameplay, right? It's the sound, it's all this other stuff. I mean, this game is just total garbage, it's awful. The series never recovered from this, not even after the Sega Saturn was introduced. Technically speaking, the Sega Saturn was actually more capable than the famous Sony PlayStation. However, programmers had a hard time with it, mostly because it had two Hitachi CPU processing chips. My understanding is that these two chips did not communicate well together, which meant that you had to do some creative things if you were going to effectively program for the system. Now, I'll tell you guys, I'm not a computer engineer by any means. If I were, I probably wouldn't be, making these videos and talking your ear off. But the simple version of this is that the programmers had a really hard time making good games for the Saturn, even though the system was more capable than the Sony PlayStation when you look at the technical specifications. This really shows when it comes to NFL 97. The 3D mode in this game is a little bit better than the Sega CD version, but it's not much. It took me a while to realize that only the X, Y, and Z buttons would pass the ball to my receivers. There's no announcer, again, and the gameplay is really lame. And it feels like it takes 1,000 years for the guys just to run a single yard. This is, without a doubt, one of the worst football games of this era. And this was so bad that Sega just gave up on it. This is the only Saturn football game that Sega produced in-house. It's the only one of these games from this series that showed up on the Sega Saturn. There was a Madden game on the Saturn, of course, and it was a lot faster than NFL 97. But all the attention was on the PlayStation version of Madden, which was faster, it looked better, and it was really impressive for its time. People who were looking for the next Madden Slayer were excited about NFL Game Day 97. However, personally, I think the graphics in this game are really lousy, and I was not impressed with the play control or the play selection.
Incomplete pass.
But all these games, this is sort of like a preview. I'm going to go into more depth about all these games sometime in the future. At any rate, NFL 97 was basically like at the total bottom of the heap. It's below the N64 games, right? So much for Genesis does what Nintendo. And this time, not even trying to buy off GamePro could help disguise just how bad this game really was. GamePro loved Game Day 97, which just shows you that their writers had no taste. NFL 97 received a review, which is something, I guess, but this is the worst score that we've seen yet. Seriously, like I said, Sega had just totally given up on this franchise, and I'm surprised that this game still came out. I mean, stop, he's already dead. Anyway, against all better judgment, Sega decided to come out with NFL 98 on the Sega Genesis. This was actually one of the last Sega Genesis cartridges to ever be released. Now, just so you know, there was a Madden 98 game for the Genesis. It came out before NFL 98, and I'm betting that none of you have ever played it. This game is really slow and clunky, and honestly, they should have never released it. That's a great sign, isn't it? Well, don't worry. Sega didn't try anything fancy with NFL 98. In fact, it didn't really try at all. This game is exactly the same as NFL Primetime. I'm not even joking. It's not any fun to play either. This game just sucks. There's no announcing at all, and it's really just a poorly designed football game. It's almost like they weren't trying anymore. And that's how the series ended. And yeah, it really sucks. I mean, this was a great series back in 1992 and 1993. How could it die a death like this? Even though February 1998 was in the era of 3D sports games, GamePro still decided to give this game a little bit of press love. If you squint your eyes a little bit and look to the bottom right, you'll see it. And yeah, this game got really crappy ratings, though at least the ratings were better than that awful Saturn game. Anyway, I don't even know why they bothered with NFL 98. It didn't sell. It's a really rare game. I mean, if you happen to have a copy of it, you should be happy. I think it's actually worth quite a bit of money. The worst thing of all, of course, is that this killed Sega's relationship with Joe Montana. Montana sued Sega for a large amount of money, claiming a breach of contract, and he probably had a good point. This Idaho newspaper claimed that it was a $5 million lawsuit, and apparently it was because Sega decided to delay NFL 98, which they did likely because the game really sucked. And that's awful, right? Because Montana was the face of Genesis does what Nintendo don't, right? And Sega just kind of went back on, its relationship with him. I've got to assume that this lawsuit was settled out of court since there are no articles about it after that one. I mean, there were a few news agencies that reported on this as late as the early 2000s, but I haven't found any announcement of how the lawsuit was settled. So let me know if you know what happened, though I'm guessing that they probably settled this out of court for some amount of money. Now, Sega did have one trick left up its sleeve, though, and it really would be a shame if I left this part out. The Sega Dreamcast was really the system that should have been the direct follow-up to the Genesis. This system was awesome and was a favorite among retro gaming enthusiasts for years and years, even after it was discontinued. Anyway, NFL 2K on the Dreamcast was easily the best football game Sega had come out with since NFL 94. And it's not just the graphics, though these are obviously great. The play control, the sound, the announcers, the plays, everything here is just simply awesome. This paved the way for the NFL 2K series, which was arguably better than Madden in the early 2000s. And seriously, we could really use games like these again. So there you have it. In the end, this story actually does have a happy ending. Well, sort of, right? So you guys know that the NFL is being run by dicks these days, and you guys know that they haven't allowed us to have any competition in the football video game market for over 20 years. But hey, maybe one of these days they'll come to their senses, they'll realize that Madden has sucked now for who knows how long, and that we need to give 2K another chance again, right? And when that day comes again, we can all rekindle our long-lost memories of these great old Joe Montana games.